Okay, hello, Dr. Eaton. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good to see you. How are you?
Good, thank you. My name is Ivan Ceballos. I am the course author for this Aku Hawaii course on Introduction to College Student Development. Thank you for spending some time with myself and the participants in this course. I thought we would start off if you could please introduce yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, so my name is Paul Eaton. I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership with a focus in higher ed administration at Sam Houston State University in Texas, just north of Houston, Texas. So my journey into this role, well, I, of course, got my master's degree in counseling and student personnel services from the University of Maryland, College Park after I completed undergraduate some years ago now. And I made my way into various roles. So I worked in the field for a little over 10 years as a practitioner, working primarily in the areas of student transition programming. So working with FYE programs on campuses, working with while I was at the University of North Texas, I worked with a program called Deferred Scholars. So students that just missed the admissions requirements. And so we had a special program for helping those students to speed up their entry into the university. And then I worked as an orientation director for 7 years down in Louisiana at UL Lafayette before finishing my doctorate degree at Louisiana State University in 2015. So this is my 4th year at Sam Houston State, 4th year on the tenure track, and it's going really fast. So I'm happy to talk to you. I love talking about theory. It's like it's my jam.
All right, excellent. So it's also fair to say, based on your experience, you've had an abundance of interactions with students in different capacities.
Yeah, lots of different capacities. So I've worked with students that are mostly going through different points of transition, but of course, working in orientation for many years, that's not just first-year students, it's also transfer students. We had a lot of adult students at UL Lafayette, so we had a pretty robust adult transition program there. And then also towards the latter part of my time at UL Lafayette, the university started getting into online learning. And actually now in my current role, I teach in a fully online master's program. So all of our master's students are online and our doc students are face-to-face. So I still work with both traditional and students that are now going to school fully in an online environment. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So let's start off, if you could please talk to us about your understanding of student development and student development theory. How would you broadly define that?
Okay, so I would broadly define it as the different ways that we conceptualize how people come to an understanding of themselves or an understanding of their place within a variety of different social networks. So how, for example, social environments might work or be structured in particular ways in order to enhance somebody's cognitive development, their moral development, any of their social identities. So I understand it as both psychological and sociological in nature, right? And then also historical, environmental, a variety of different things related to those types of concepts. So it's about viewing a person's experience in a holistic manner and trying to understand what we can do within an educational environment to support that person's meaning making, but also to challenge them to sometimes move themselves in particular directions based on aims and objectives of the university or things that we want to help them get out of the educational experience.
Okay. So it seems apparent that student development theory tends to borrow from different fields. You mentioned sociology, psychology, and has some practical implications as well, some of the outcomes you mentioned. Could you share any advice you would have to anyone who's starting to learn about college student development?
Okay, the first piece of advice that I have is to not get overwhelmed by theory. So sometimes when you're reading these theoretical articles, you're getting, even if you're just getting an overview like you're getting in a class like this, right? It can be like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff that I don't know about, and I don't, how am I going to learn all of this kind of stuff? There is a lot of research. There's a lot of ways that we can think about student development, and it can feel overwhelming. So I just encourage people to not get overwhelmed, first of all. The second thing is to keep an open mind. Sometimes we'll read particular theories, we'll be exposed to theories. We maybe don't agree with the theory in a particular way. We may have different world experiences that may cause us to think that, this theory is either correct or incorrect. And that's actually what theory's role is in our lives and in the academy, is to help us to have a conversation about, what's meaningful to me as a person or a practitioner, what's meaningful to the students that I work with. How do we structure the educational environment in particular ways with particular types of aims? Theory helps us to do that. And then I think the third piece of advice I would give is to be open to critiquing theory, right? That all theory is inherently going to have something that it doesn't catch, right? One of my favorite phrases is this idea from a French post-structuralist theorist that I like to cite a lot, Deleuze, who talks about how something always escapes, right? So even theories, while they're helpful, okay, the reason we have theory is because we observe things as humans in the environment, or we empirically test things, and we see that most of the time it works, or it's approximately rigorously correct, right? The theory helps us to see some things, but there's always something that escapes. There's always something we didn't think about. There's always, these couple of cases that don't fit into this model or this way of thinking about it or whatever. And that's fine, right? That's why we have to be open to critiquing the theory and saying like, yeah, this works most of the time, but is there anyone it doesn't work for? And what does it mean that it might not work for that student or that population? Or if we're going to use a theory to inform an educational initiative, who are we leaving out if that theory doesn't apply to every single person in our environment, right? So that's where critique is really important.
It seems like some of those critiques or trying to understand who is being left out connects with this module, which in particular looks at gender identity or expression, race and ethnicity. Can you talk to us about how those theories came about, what purpose they serve, and what a practitioner can gain from understanding these theories?
Okay, so racial identity theory, let's start there, right? A lot of the earliest theories that came out started arising, I would say, in at least the ones that we use now in higher ed. They came out a lot in the civil rights era, right? So campuses were changing a lot in the 1960s, 1970s in terms of the types of students who were coming to college, the types of access that people were getting. And so there was a desire and a need for us as practitioners in student affairs to understand, okay, well, if the racial composition of the campus is changing, how do we support people's racial identity development? Or how do we understand the way that people interact cross-racially, right? So there was a lot of models that got developed that talked about race, for example, as a social construct, okay? So how does race get socially created in environments? Part of that is historical, of course, but part of it is also, race happens in a space, like it just does happen. And we were trying to understand how to navigate changing racial dynamics on college campuses. Some of those models were about the psychological aspect, like I said. How do we come to understand ourselves as racialized beings? A lot of the early models that we used were really developed around people of color. So Cross's model of psychological nigrescence talks about how do Black people come to understand themselves as Black people. Then, you know, we have models that look at Asian Pacific American racial identity development. We have models that look at Latinx racial identity development. Well, it's kind of shifted a little bit recently because we're realizing it's more complicated, right? So for example, ethnic identity development for a long time was based on Finney's model. And Finney's model is helpful in terms of a baseline from where to start, but we also recognized that, well, Finney's model doesn't really work, for example, for Latinx students, right? So people like Basti Torres started doing research on, okay, well, how do Latinx students come to understand themselves both racially and ethnically? And of course, race for Latinx students is a complicated discussion because of the history of the US Census, because of the history of how the country took over lands that were initially occupied and belonged to people who we now would call Mexican Americans, but they were racialized. So there's all these kinds of things that get brought up, and so we're complicating the conversation now around like how do we think about race or ethnicity, and we can talk about that. Same thing with gender, right? So we used to think gender was a binary construction, and for a long time, a lot of the early work on gender was about women because women were denied access to the academy for so long. And then around like in the early, well, I'm trying to think, yeah, I guess in the mid 2000s, there was this kind of interest in, well, how do men come to understand themselves as gendered beings, right? So a lot of the research on masculinity, toxic masculinity started happening. And then, of course, we're now in a space where we're talking about gender as not binary. It's as a social construction, again, and a psychological thing. Mm-hmm. And so folks like Z. Nicolazzo, Halberstam, other folks are doing research on, you know, how do we break down gender outside of the binary, and why is that important for us to do in terms of disrupting the kind of norms that we assign to gender roles, for example, which again is socially constructed, but carries a lot of weight in our educational environments, right? People, and we can go into all kinds of examples of that, so.
Thank you. I think you've done a great job explaining some of the complexity that surrounds identity. Something we explore in this course is the concept of intersectionality. Mm-hmm. Can you, in your own words, explain what that means?
Right. So intersectionality is a term that actually comes from critical race studies. Critical legal studies is where it actually started. Kimberly Crenshaw is often the person who is credited with coining that term. And this is about the idea of how do different social identities interact in particular ways. And I would say really in terms of analyzing the way that people are oppressed in society, or the way that power dynamics in terms of privilege and oppression play out. So let me give you an example. If I'm looking at myself as an intersectional person, I need to understand that I'm a white person. That's how I self-identify. I have a white racial identity. I need to understand what that means in the current context as well as historically. I also understand that I'm a man, okay, or I identify as a man. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm socially constructed as a man. And so the intersection of my white identity and my male identity, because those have been historically privileged positions in our society and within the academy, those intersect in particular ways to give me access to certain types of spaces. Now I can lay another aspect of my identity on there, which is my queer identity. So I identify as a gay man. And so I know that in that way, I'm not privileged, right, in terms of the way society has structured things. So my gay identity or my queer identity leaves me in some cases in a marginalized position. When I'm looking at intersectionality, I'm looking at how do different combinations of those things in different environmental contexts play out in particular types of ways to either put me in a position of privilege or leave me in a position of potentially being oppressed. So for me, I think that intersectionality is really about looking at how these different social identities operate in terms of power dynamics and in terms of social settings in particular types of ways. It's really about examining that. Now, there's another theory we could talk about that's kind of a counteract to that, but I don't want to go there if we're not ready to go there. So let's.
That'll be for the next course.
Yeah. Maybe the next course, right?
I think you highlighted quite well how identity and privilege or social settings are connected. You cannot, at least within a social institution like a college or university, separate that. Given that the people in this course are specifically those within housing, now that we know this, or we collectively as an institution or its employees gain a stronger understanding of identity or issues related to it, such as privilege or oppression, what can we do? What are the next steps to enact our understanding of identity-based theories into action? What are the goals or outcomes we should achieve based on this knowledge?
Okay, so one thing is like housing's a great place to talk about identity stuff because so much of what happens in housing is really rooted in social identities. For example, we often have housing segregated by gender, okay? And that might be like we have whole buildings that are designated for males or females. We may do that by floor. If we're thinking about gender as a non-binary type of situation, if we create, how do we account for the non-binary in housing assignments, for example, right? This is something that I think is very important. So we need to understand how thinking of gender in a non-binary fashion would change perhaps our policies and procedures in terms of housing assignments or the way that we construct buildings. So even something as simple as, do we decide that we're going to make all of the, restroom facilities in our building gender neutral or something to that nature, right? So it impacts the way that we think about how we want to construct the environments. Same thing with like, okay, we can take a racial example. There is a lot of research to suggest that on predominantly white campuses, for example, that students of color often feel marginalized and need some sort of safe space in order to develop their cultural identity, their racial identity, and they're in a non-racial majority position. So, if I was a Black person and I'm on a PWI campus, I'm surrounded by white people all the time. Developing a healthy sense of my identity as a Black person will necessitate and require that I also be surrounded by Black people sometimes. So one way that housing policy has supported students in their racial and ethnic identity development is sometimes we create living learning communities, or we might create certain types of cultural houses or things of this nature. And that's a way, it's a policy and an educational practice that allows us to support students in their healthy growth and development in terms of their racial and ethnic identity, and provide them a safe place to live based on how they choose to identify. A third example I can think of is like deals with sexuality, right? So sometimes some campuses, I don't know what it's like at Miami, but people are all from all across the country. On some campuses, we might have policies about things like you can't have opposite sex people in your room, right? Like visitation policies or something like that, right? Well, that sort of a policy is based on a heteronormative understanding of, of the way that people are in terms of their sexual identity, right? It assumes that all people are heterosexual. So if you don't allow people to have opposite sex roommates, it's because you think, well, those people are obviously going to be sexually interested in each other, right? That's why we have those kinds of policies. Well, the issue there is that not only that you're assuming that everyone's heterosexual, but also that, some students might see that as unfair. So if you have a same-sex couple and they're able to room together, right, that can have both positives and negatives. Like if that couple were to break up, how do you deal with that sort of thing? So I hope I'm answering your question.
You have. You've provided some very tangible examples of theory into practice, so thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Those are all the questions I have, but before we wrap up, I wanted to see if there's anything else you would want to share to the participants in this course.
I would just say that, like, a lot of times, I literally was just having this conversation yesterday. I hope that what you'll take from a course like this is that theory can guide practice, right? A lot of times what ends up happening, and I judged a case study competition yesterday with master students. And one of the things that me and the other judges were talking about was that students knew theory, right? Like there were all these guidelines around, here's a case, so, pick a theory, apply it, all this kind of stuff. Well, students weren't able to take theory and apply it to practice. So I guess what I would say is that if you're studying some kind of theory, knowing the theory is important, but knowing how to apply the theory to some sort of educational end is probably the more important part of the process. And I think it's not where we always do a good job of connecting the two. So when you're thinking about anything that you're doing in your workplace, in your residence halls, whatever the case is, if you're designing an initiative, think about what theory is going to inform it and how it's going to impact different types of people in particular types of ways, and be intentional about rooting things in a theoretical construct in some cases, or multiple theoretical constructs to go back to intersectionality, because that's where we can use theory to actually influence the types of experiences that students have on campus. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. So that would be my takeaway.
I think that's an incredible takeaway. I don't think I could have thought of a better way to wrap up this segment of the course. So Dr. Eaton, on behalf of myself, obviously, and those participating, thank you so much for your time and your insight. I think you've provided a lot of value and a lot of understanding to this part of the course. So again, my thank you to you and my appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to talk to you.